Hey friends, we're back. Welcome to the Progressive Mind Center podcast. This is Tom, and I have Michael with me again today. Hope you enjoyed our last podcast where we talked about fitness and mental health. Today, we're actually going to be talking about challenging negative thoughts and thought processes. And Michael took some notes, and we're going to bounce things back and forth. I've noticed that I've had to help a lot of clients using the intervention cognitive behavioral therapy with actually attacking their negative thoughts and thought patterns. It's just interesting because a lot of this is learned in our society. When you think about how you compare yourself to others and how you're not quite measuring up, you tend to start to focus on your shortcomings and how you're not comparing to others, or how you don't have the latest gear or tech or clothing. Things like that, and how that permeates your mental health and wellness, so that we end up focusing on those negative things versus the positive. So today we're going to be discussing that and some helpful techniques to help you challenge some of those negative thoughts. So once again, welcome back, Michael Schreiber, to the podcast. Michael, thanks again for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It was fun last time, and I'm looking forward to this topic as well. And when we talked about what the topic was going to be, I immediately thought of my reaction after listening to last week's episode 1. And I was thinking about my own negative thoughts that I had about me after listening to it. I was hesitant. I was very reluctant, actually, to listen to the podcast, and I wasn't sure how I would come off. And I don't know about you, but I don't listen to my own voice very much from the outside. So I don't think we actually really know how we sound. And I think we're all kind of self-conscious about that. And
It's so true, and not just with sounding, but also your appearance too. I don't know how many times I've heard myself on a voice message, or seeing myself on a video somewhere, or whether it's a picture or a video. I'm like, wow, I sound like that. I look like that. I have a totally different picture in my mind.
yeah, I don't even like hearing myself on my outgoing message. I would try and skip through that if I'm listening to messages. But so that was the first thing that I thought of after last week's episode. I was kind of like, oh my God, I got to listen to this now, because I thought, it was kind of my duty to listen to it.
Sure.
But, for lots of reasons. Because I wanted to find out how it sounded, because I wanted to listen to you a little bit more, because I knew that I was afraid to do it. So I figured you probably have to do it. And so I did. And I was actually pleasantly surprised. I didn't think I sounded that bad. But there were some things that as I was listening, I took note of that bothered me. I realized how slowly I talk. My wife has pointed this out to me also, as a point of annoyance and aggravation. And I'm kind of a slow talker, and I say way too much. And so I'm consciously more aware of that right now. And I'm going to be more conscious of that going forward. So that was actually really helpful to listen to myself. And I can use that going forward, because I was wondering, after I listened to myself, how do clients perceive that? Is that annoying to them? Is that frustrating to them? Do I lose them? Is there something about, my cadence or my communication or my tone or some of the verbal tics that we all have that are frustrating to patients, and we lose them? And if they lose interest, then, well, I mean, that's not good. That's not
right. And you lose credibility with the client too, where if they're not really paying attention, then they're not listening to, the interventions or the suggestions that you're offering on how to maybe change or make some positive changes in their lives. I mean, I'm that way too. And I think I've had to learn over the years, and I notice myself doing it when I listen back, that I do tend to get stuck. And it's because my mind is going so fast that like I have to kind of slow it down. And I notice that there'll be these long, seemingly dramatic but not purposeful pauses in my speech. And I've wondered that too, so much that I've even shared with clients, hey, my mind's going so fast, so I apologize if I tend to get stuck. And you're probably like following me much faster than I think that you are, but it's not you. I'm not trying to dumb it down for you. I'm actually like really lost in the thought and trying to grab it back if it's racing, you know. So I've had to work on toning it down
Yeah.
and to try to make my voice, especially with hypnosis, really have that genuine kind of nice cadence, you know, and be, you know, warm and caring, and be able to express the empathy the way that I want to. But in times, especially when I'm stressed, I tend to start stumbling and using and you know
Mm-hmm.
getting stuck in there. So
Mm-hmm.
I've had to try to learn to slow my mind down and to talk with purpose and try to enunciate and make sure that the message I'm sending is received
Right.
well. So, but when I listened to you on the track, I wasn't judging at all, and I do that sort of naturally, come from a non-judgmental place. But I thought that it sounded fantastic. In in the same regard, I was actually critiquing my own like voice, and where I should have, you know, said it this way, or I used the wrong kind of word, and you know, it just didn't flow the way that I wanted it to. But as far as your commentary went, I thought it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, I was engrossed with exactly what you were saying. So
Well,
I'm trying
appreciate
to
it.
aspire to be that way when I'm communicating too,
I mean, it's
especially
so,
in this format.
I mean, it's so funny that you say that, because after I listened to it, I was thinking, wow, Tom sounded so much better than I did. So, you know, it's a perfect example of how we get in our own heads. And, you know, we have difficulty getting out of our own heads, and how our perception of ourselves oftentimes is so distorted. And it's a shame that we can't see ourselves as we really are. And it's very difficult to see ourselves from the outside in instead of the inside out. And you know, I guess we just continue to try and do that. And so for me, listening back to myself, listening back to last week's recording, was a way of hearing myself a little bit more, getting to know myself maybe a little bit better. Um, so that was actually really helpful to me, just personally. That was very helpful to me. But I also realized afterwards how critical I am of myself. You know, the thoughts that, uh, you know, there were moments when I really focused in on something I said, or if I hesitated during our conversation, and I was really very harsh with myself. And just so I came away from that experience with some negative thoughts about myself, but I was aware of them. You know, I became aware of them. And so, you know, when we spoke about doing this topic, I immediately thought of how I felt after last week's episode, and kind of being harsh with myself, and how that's a theme, I think, in probably all of our lives. It's a narrative that is a very, you know, it's a common thread. And there it was again,
Hmm. Yeah.
coming
Well, and
up.
I think good elements to the fact that we've grown up learning to try to be better, to try to improve in some fashion. And just naturally, it comes with comparing ourselves to others and trying to not be better than them, but try to aspire to be on the same level. The only problem is where you become obsessed with that instead of focusing on the positives and the things that you do have and that you already are, and then boosting and exploiting your own strengths. So in my practice, that's really what I'm focused on as I try to empower people, is to uncover what their strengths are and how to exploit those strengths and use their gifts without so much focusing on all the different things that they need to change. I mean, because bottom line, myself included, we really don't want to change. I mean, we're creatures of comfort.
Mm,
So it takes a lot of effort on our part, maybe physically, sometimes emotionally, definitely mentally, to make lasting and sustainable changes in our life. And that's freaking hard. I don't want to. I don't want to have to do that. So trying to teach somebody else how to do that becomes a challenge in and of itself. So as far as empowerment, building on what they're already strong at and giving them some self-confidence
yeah,
and finding ways to boost that, I have found to be very helpful.
yeah,
And it's much deeper than, of course, just, well, think happy thoughts. I mean, that sounds really good, but it's much more difficult to do because we are so ingrained. It's ingrained in us to focus on those negatives.
sure. Yeah, and I think oftentimes when the harsh self-criticisms arise, to me that's an old voice that's talking to us, and it isn't always our voice. I think it's the voice of our parents, our grandparents, brother, sister, teachers, you know, whomever, but it becomes our voice. That oppressive voice that was at one time coming from an outside source becomes an inside source. It becomes our own voice. And I often wonder, what is the function of that? Why are we critical of ourselves? What does that do for us? What is the payoff?
Hmm.
And I don't know that I've arrived at a hypothesis yet. But there is something to that. And because I was thinking about it earlier, and I was thinking it's occupying. It is occupying. It's this conversation that you have with yourself, and it is occupying. There's something compelling about it. It's processing a conflict, maybe. I don't know if you had thoughts on that, but that's what I was thinking about earlier.
No, I really like that. I didn't even think about it that way, about it occupying time and what could be the benefit of it. And there must be some benefit, or else we wouldn't do it. I mean, and so that sparks some curiosity and interest on my part as to, because I have that exact thing, like a lot of us have that thing. What is it there for? Where does it come from? But more importantly, what do we do with it? How do we control that? Maybe how can we use that as a strength? I think if you're listening to that inner critic and it's helping you become better, it's driving you towards uh, getting closer to perfection, which of course we're not going to be completely perfect. No, nobody's going to be there, but we can aspire to be as close to it as we can. Some days probably easier than others to get closer to that.
Right.
But so if it's driving us, um, I think it can be helpful and we can harness that power. But on the flip side, if it's causing stress and anxiety and self-doubt, even loathing and depression, I think there's requires some sort of intervention, whether we intervene ourselves or whether we seek help from a professional or even just a friend to kind of kick us in the ass or make us snap out of it, or at least curtail that. So uh, anyway, yeah, those are my
Yeah.
thoughts on
But
that.
anyway, that's what I was thinking about. I was really thinking about patients who are very critical of themselves and how they want to stop doing that, but have so much trouble not doing that. They have so much trouble not doing the thing they don't want to do. And why it's hard, it's self-harm. It's injurious. And why is it so difficult to stop doing something that is painful and injurious? And I think part of it is that it's reflexive, it's automatic, it's so ingrained in a person, in the self, that there is something that, I don't know, it feels like an equation gets balanced when you engage in that kind of pattern. There's something about it that feels comfortable, maybe. There's something about it that feels comfortable. And I think it's a learned behavior, like you were talking about earlier. A lot of this, these kind of cognitions are learned. They're learned thought patterns, and they can be unlearned. It's hard. It's much harder to unlearn something than to learn it sometimes.
Yeah. I think you are spot on that it's comfortable for us, and this is just how we've always been. And when you're comfortable, I mean, you're not going to completely change that or eradicate it, overnight. And there is a compulsion, I think, and maybe we engage in that compulsion with the inner critic because it, just like with OCD, how it reduces the obsessive thoughts. Maybe it reduces our overall anxiety. Maybe we've learned, since we are creatures of learning, that by worrying about something, it prevents it from happening. Even though we don't think that we're magical, and we've prevented that from happening because we worried about it. But if you worry about something long enough and then that doesn't happen, you're worried about giving a speech, and you agonize over it and agonize over it, and you get up there and you give this speech or lecture or whatever, and you were great, and you're actually coming out of it feeling really motivated about yourself. It's like you learn, well, in the recesses of your mind, that by worrying about it, I prevented the bad from actually occurring, even though consciously you're not saying, well, I'm relating it to that, I'm associating it with the fact that I worried. But we learned, and then we continue to do that, and that's where the comfort comes in.
It's we're an interesting species. The superstitiousness of some of that of our thinking. It's just remarkable. One one book that I really like is called The Worry Cure by Robert Leahy, and he was, I don't know, maybe he was the director of the Cognitive Behavioral Therapy Institute in New York here, and I really like it. I really like that book. It's a really good book. Um, it's very relatable, and I really like using it. I recommend it. I've read read it myself, and I recommend it to patients.
The Worry
Yeah.
Cure,
The
Robert
Work Cure.
Leahy.
Yeah, Robert Leahy. Um, Free plug for Mr. Leahy. And really very good book. Um, and he talks about how when you are worrying, you kind of feel like you're actually doing something. It feels like you're doing something. I'm thinking about this thing. I'm strategizing. I'm planning. So that's maybe why worry is so compelling and so compulsive, because it really feels like you're doing something of action, when in actuality, maybe not. It's hard. Sometimes it's hard to figure out what is productive worry and what is unproductive worry, because they look the same, they feel the same.
Yeah, how do you tell the difference?
Um, results,
Uh-huh.
results, I think.
Mm.
If you worried about something enough and you figure out a solution for it, then maybe that was productive worry.
Sure, that makes sense. Yeah.
I mean,
And the opposite being that you're just agonizing over it and ruminating over it, and you don't really come or arrive at any type of real solution that would be helpful or rational for you. You're just stuck in that agonizing over it.
that would
That's a
be
horrible
me. You're
place to
talking
be.
about me, I think, right there.
Well, myself included, and the people that I work with, clients that I try to help, and they find themselves in that agonizing rut too. And those that negative self-talk, those negative tapes are just running and running constantly.
Mhm.
Um, and you can't just say, well, we'll stop playing those friggin' tapes, But
Yeah.
so I give them some techniques to help. And really, the first one we touched on this in the last podcast about being mindful, and that's one of the first things that I start to teach is how to be mindful and the art of mindfulness. And I give them some simple trainings. And I don't remember if I had touched on this last time, but one of the ones is at whatever moment you're in, whatever environment you're in, is to imagine if you had to write that as a chapter in a novel, how would you describe it using all of your senses? Of course, the sense of smell and taste might be out if there's not food around. But if there is, then you can enlist all five of your senses to really fully describe. If you've read a novel and there's a chapter where, and some authors are better at it than others, where they're just describing the room, and you're page after page, you're like, let me get out of this flipping a room. But I mean, you feel like you're in the room. I mean, you feel like you can see everything that is being written. You can hear maybe some sounds, and even there's an emotional attachment involved. So using your senses, and I use a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 type of thing. Name 5 things you can see, like fully realize them and describe them. 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. And you can flip the order around. I mean, if you're having a nice meal, maybe there are 5 different things or flavors that you can taste, and 4 things you can see, and 3 things you can, you get the picture. But being in the moment is really helpful, because it turns that tape off that's running. It turns those thoughts off, because when you're trying to describe your environment as if you had to write it in a novel, or you're listing the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 types of things, you're in it. You're in the moment. You're not focused on those thoughts, and that seems to help a little bit.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I think probably the opposite of worry is mindfulness. Because if you're being fully mindful, there's no time to worry.
There's no space.
Right. Right. There's no need to worry if you're being mindful. If you're being mindful, everything is being taken care of that needs to be taken care of. I heard this once, that depressed people worry about the past and anxious people worry about the future. So when you have people that are anxious and depressed, they're nowhere near the present, and that's what brings on being disturbed, and it's maladaptive, and it brings in a lot of angst and agitation. So I agree, mindfulness is super important. I couldn't agree more. So that's what I was thinking about after last episode, kind of about my own self critiques and being harsh with myself, and where that comes from. And to be more aware of that. And so this was a practice that really made me more aware of it, and I think that's good for me.
Michael, what types of things do you do to maybe silence that inner critic, or at least curtail that, or sort of your self intervention techniques?
Well, I don't think that pushing it away is I don't think pushing it away works necessarily. I think you've got to look at the self-critic and understand what it's there for. What is it trying to do? Why am I doing this to myself? What am I trying to accomplish? And to not be, because I think what happens is folks want to be less negative, and then when they are trying to be less negative and fail, that's one more thing to criticize themselves about. Oh, see, I failed at not being positive. So I think figuring a way to get out of that pattern and gaining some perspective and just observing. And this is what I tell patients. You've got to be an audience to all the stuff that goes on, all the crazy thinking that goes on. Just be an audience. Just observe that. Just, have a seat in the auditorium, and your thoughts are on the stage, and you're just watching your thoughts and what they do. And you can do that with your emotions too. Just watch what is going on with your emotion. Don't act on those thoughts or the emotions. Just watch them. And that, to me, that's helpful for me, and that's what I also tell clients. And I think it works. And it's just like, to kind of to go back to what we were talking about last week, it's just like exercising any muscle. It's a muscle that has to be worked over and over again, and it becomes more reflexive over time. But that's really one thing. I think the mindfulness piece is very helpful too, meditation, but awareness. I think awareness is absolutely key, because if you're not aware of what's going on in you, if you're not aware of your thoughts, then they're going to take hold of you. They're going to grip you, and you're going to be a slave to your impulses.
That's really important to be aware, to acknowledge those thoughts, those feelings that are occurring. So many times when we try to avoid it, they're still there and they're still having an impact. And in fact, probably more of a negative impact on our lives than positive if we're not being aware
Yeah.
and acknowledging what those are. So I really like that, just observing, removing yourself from the thoughts and the feelings and the emotional attachment to it, and just watching what's going on, and just taking it in as if you're watching from an outside perspective.
And that's a meditation technique. Honestly, it's with you're meditating and a thought comes, gets stirred up in you. You just allow it to be there. You don't react to it necessarily. You just let it be there, and then you let it leave. It arrives and then it departs. And so I think that's an important skill that can be learned to avoid sort of the kind of the chronic negative thinking. It's the chronic negative thinking that is really very problematic. I think you probably agree with that. That we see when folks come to us and say, "I'm having trouble," and this is what I'm having trouble with. It's the chronic obsessive negative thinking that is
Right.
really very interfering in the lives of our patients.
Absolutely. And they are finding it very difficult to shut that off. They don't want that to be the case, and they're seeking help. And of course, it becomes very challenging because we're not telling people what to do. We're just kind of offering suggestions and interventions and homework too. But like we said before, even looking at ourselves, we don't necessarily like to change, or we may want to change, but the actual work involved with doing it um, uh, becomes a challenge because we are creatures of comfort. So week after week, or month after month, continuing to have these obsessive thoughts, speaking about our clients. Um, and not knowing what to do. And it seems like we're replaying the same session over and over again, and
Hmm.
utilizing the same sort of techniques, not only mindfulness and some version of meditation, or acknowledging the thoughts and the feelings, but also with cognitive behavioral therapy, where we're identifying the thoughts and understanding that you have the power and ability to change those thoughts much more readily than you do have the ability to change your emotions, and even maybe the consequence or the behavior of them. I mean, this is just simple ABCs of emotion, or the whole root of cognitive behavioral therapy. But really understanding that there are um, two different types of thoughts. Well, actually three, but for simplicity's sake, two different types: a positive thought and a negative thought. And that's really based on your perception of the situation. There's something that happens, some activating event, and you can either think positively about that or negatively. And most often, we find my clients, especially, are focusing on the negative thought that's attached to whatever that event was, versus the positive one. And it's just like building strength or building your muscles. It takes some work and practice at doing that. First identifying, and that means you have to acknowledge that you're having these thoughts,
Hmm.
and then understanding that maybe that's a positive thought, or is that a negative thought in my life. The third one that I won't talk too much about is neutral. That's, just like you're sleeping on a Saturday morning and it starts raining outside and you don't have any place to be. I mean, are your thoughts positive or negative? Neutral is just one of those, like, I'm just, you know, it's raining. Okay,
Mhm.
whatever.
Mhm.
Like, I'll go back to sleep or I'll go get a snack or something. But there was something that you mentioned earlier that I wanted to bring back up, and it was about things being automatic, and specifically our thoughts are automatic, and we don't realize that we're having these negative thoughts. It's just the example I always use is when you're driving and you see brake lights in front of you, you step on the gas. You're not thinking, I need to step on the gas, that person's slowing down or stopping, because you've learned that this is what it means when I see brake lights. I need to slow my vehicle down to prevent an accident from happening.
Mhm.
So the thought is still there. It's just an automatic, quick reflex to that. And a lot of things in our lives are that, and triggers, but triggers is kind of a blanket term. So automatic thoughts in particular that I want to, share with you about
Sure.
this, and how to really attack those and identify. Well, it starts by identifying your thoughts as to becoming comfortable and practicing whether they're negative or positive. And then once you realize that, once you get good at doing that, you can start looking at these other triggers or these other automatic thoughts and attacking those.
Yeah. So something I wanted to mention earlier was that I think sometimes the negative cognitions are actually an adaptation to something. It's just like when you don't think, oh, I need to step on the brake now because the car in front of me, their back lights went on. That's an adaptation because if you have to spend time thinking about that, you're going to be in an accident. And so I think there's a survival element of those automatic thoughts. I mean, you and I are breathing in and out now. We're not thinking about breathing. We're not thinking, okay, I got to breathe in now. I got to breathe out now. It's survival, because if that's all that we could think about, we wouldn't be able to do anything else. So I think that there's an element of the negative cognitions that I think we have to think about them as an adaptation. Anything, any coping mechanism, because I think we could even think of them as some kind of coping mechanism. We have to think of it as an adaptation to a stressor. So maybe when we were growing up, we were the victims of abuse, and somebody was harsh with us. If we can take their words and make them our own, maybe it takes the sting away to a degree. Maybe that's a way of being in control. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe. And so if we could think of it, so that's an adaptation. That's coping with a stressor, a stressful, traumatizing even environment. And I think that we can think of negative thoughts that way. It gets us over the hump in a way. I don't know how else to really describe it. Somebody more scholarly than me could probably articulate it better. But I don't know. What are your thoughts about that?
I think that you did a great job, and I think that that keys into all the things we've been saying about how we've learned this process, that we um, uh, find comfort in our critic and our negative thoughts, and that I think that that's huge that you said an adaptation, because um, it furthers our growth and development, not necessarily in a positive direction, but as human beings, we learn from our experiences, and um, we put that knowledge into our subconscious mind so that we can either prevent something from happening or that we can react in a more appropriate way, that we can overcome adversity or challenges, or like you said, with regards to being in abuseful situations, to protect yourself, so that you can actually function and have somewhat productive, dare even a successful existence. So you can
Hmm.
still interact with others, so you can still take care of yourself. You can meet all of your basic needs. Um,
Yeah, I think
so
I
that,
think we're on the right track there. Because if we could even think of it as if you if somebody grows up with a narcissistic parent, right? I can't have a self-esteem. If I have a self-esteem, good self-esteem, that's threatening to my narcissistic parent who has to take care of me. So if I can find a way of having a lousier self-esteem, that might actually keep me safer. It
mhm,
might actually be less challenging and less threatening to my narcissistic parent.
yeah.
So I think that's a way of, that's just an example that I just kind of thought
Mhm.
of this theory about where maybe these negative cognitions come from. It's some kind of adaptation to trauma, I think. And when look, I think we can boil down most pathology to some kind of trauma, big, small, macro, micro. I think that's what we can boil it down to.
Absolutely. I'm with you 100%. I think that you really nailed it, that that is a key element. And this is the key to unraveling sort of what's going on if you want to make any kind of changes to your negative thoughts and your negative thought patterns, is understanding, whether you know exactly where it came from or not, that this was some sort of adaptation that you had to life and the experience that you had in life, and the subsequent traumas that unfurled, whether it's huge traumatic events or whether it's just something small, still very impactful in your life, because that's when we can really fully understand uh, how we can adapt to something new that's healthier, that um, promotes growth in a positive direction.
Yeah. I also think that we should think of kind of the negative self-talk as a way of trying to improve and be better. I think folks that are really very harsh with themselves expect a lot of themselves, I think. And they want to be better. They want to improve. They want to grow. So they're so desperate for that. I think they so very much want to be good enough, and they really want to be better people, and when they're not, it's disappointing, and they're angry with themselves, I
Mhm.
think, when they feel like they failed themselves.
No, I've seen that exactly in the practice, and all the more reason and importance on focusing on what they are good at, what their strengths are, and where they have succeeded, where they have accomplished in life, and learning from those and finding a way to use those skills to further and to, you've solved this problem, you've overcome this in the past. How can we use that um, uh, as a way to and tweak that and adapt it so that you can take on this new problem or this new challenge. Another thing I use to challenge, and this is actually from Albert Ellis. You probably heard of rational emotive behavioral therapy,
um,
RABT.
Jewish
Eh,
guy from the Bronx, so
yeah,
I
you,
I had it's my duty
you
to
guys were bros. Yeah.
revere him.
Uh, and he was about like, show me the evidence that supports that thought, and
Mhm,
I've used it even in practice with as if you and I have them play, do some role playing, have them play both roles. If you were an attorney defending yourself and defending that
mhm,
thought or whatever you're thinking about yourself, how could you defend it? And then on the flip side, how could you prosecute that from the other attorney? Like if
mhm,
you're in front of a jury and you're having to establish the opposite, uh,
mhm,
could you prove that? And what would be the evidence that you would use to support both of those? And I think that that has helped some of my clients just gain some insight
mhm.
into those thoughts and where they're coming from, and the fact that they may even be irrational thoughts, and that sort of takes the sting or the power away from them. It gives them back the control over it.
Yeah, that's kind of the disputing, debating strategy that Ellis talks about so much. There's a really good CBT worksheet that's just exactly that. It's kind of gives the example of the prosecution and the defendant and the jury, and so I've used that in some CBT groups that I've run also, and I think it's helpful. I think what it does is it helps folks gain some perspective, so they can find a way out of that thinking and realize that there are other ways of thinking about things other than how they've learned how to think. So that's really helpful. I think that's been very helpful in my experience. And I've run several CBT groups, and that's always one that I like to do. I like to do that worksheet. And Albert Ellis is one of my favorite guys. I think he was really so spot on with the neurotic thinking. I think he was just a genius at curing neurotic thinking, because a lot of it is very neurotic thinking.
Yeah.
There's some really great, you probably know on YouTube, just some great Albert Ellis videos that are out there of him working with real patients, which was
Hmm.
fantastic. I was very lucky shortly before he died, at the RABT Institute in Manhattan. He would do his Friday night
Hmm.
demonstrations,
Right.
and I was lucky enough to see him do some demonstrations one night, and it's fascinating. He was a fascinating guy, and he was a flawed guy too. He was quite flawed. He was pretty angry. He didn't have a lot of patience with people. He didn't have patience
Hmm.
with his patients, and so he was clearly a flawed guy himself. And I think a lot of the stuff that he came up with, the theory, was to cure his own neuroses.
Yeah.
But anyway, I think also, just introducing clients just to some of the theory behind this stuff, even that in itself, I think can be helpful.
Hmm.
Of
Yeah.
course, a lot of the skills training and those kinds of things are very helpful. But I think just the theory behind this stuff, I think that in itself can be very helpful to patients.
Absolutely. They're learning, and it helps the client kind of see you on a different level, and not have you so high up as you're the expert, but that you're an actual human being who's dealing with similar types of things, maybe not on the same scale, but you're on this roller coaster as well. That we're on this roller coaster together, kind of figuring it out. And these are some of the things that I've used to help myself overcome, to slow down my thinking, to think more positively, to reduce my own anxiety. Um, and maybe if you utilize these two, they could be helpful in your life, or maybe we can learn some other things together and you can try them out. There's definitely not a cookie cutter approach. Everybody is an individual, and what works for some may not work for others. But I think that's why I really enjoy being a therapist and being a collaborative type of therapist, because I'm always learning and growing and improving, and I get to impact somebody's life in a positive way.
Absolutely. I'm not sure that there's anything much better as a clinician when you've seen somebody gain insight. That's there's a that's a it's almost euphoric,
Mhm.
almost euphoric when you can impact somebody, and so they've gained insight. Um, that's incredibly gratifying.
Mhm. It is very satisfying to know that I played a hand in that, that I at least held the space, and where they were able to gain insight, whether it's something that I said or suggested, or maybe just the process in and of itself. I think probably more importantly, it's really just the process of being there, being in a safe place,
Mhm.
feeling safe with, the therapist, and being able to share, things on a deeper level than you would just a friend or even a colleague. Just the fact that we create this space for them.
Right.
for them to heal, I think is wonderful. On the flip side, it's kind of sad for me, immensely gratifying and satisfying when somebody does not need me anymore. But that's where the sadness comes in, is that uh, they don't, and that's where I want them to go. I want them to not need me. I want them to have the internal resources and tools available to um, grow in that situation, but also use that learning and those newly acquired strengths and adapt them to new challenges and problems. And when I see them able to do that, I get a great sense of pride, but also the sadness that well, they don't need me anymore, and they're going to move on and have great, healthy, productive lives.
I think that, that goes for a lot of professions, healthcare, education, to try and make myself obsolete. I think you can apply that to educators, physical therapists. I think you could apply that to a lot of different professions. But especially I think as therapists, the idea is not for patients to be um, dependent on us. The idea is for them to be dependent on themselves.
Yeah.
But I completely agree with you there.
Uh,
So
yeah. No. I was agreeing as well. I had one other technique that I wanted to share for the listeners, and this is for challenging negative thoughts. And this is something I've used in my practice, and it's something that I learned from seminars from Dr. Aldo Pucci, who's a founder of the National Association of Cognitive Behavioral Therapists. Um, and it's about looking at irrational thoughts and identifying irrational thoughts, and sort of weeding out. And he has these rational questions that he uses. And I've used a form of these rational questions with clients, and I found it, and they have found it to be very helpful. And not only identifying whether the thought is negative or positive, but also whether or not it's rational for them, specifically rational for them. And in a sense, without going through the whole questions, it's basically assuring that the thought is factual, and that it is helping you achieve your goals, and that it's helping you feel the way that you want to feel. If it's not doing any of those things, then it's irrational. And over time, you can learn to cast away those irrational thoughts, just observe them for what they are,
mhm,
and not give them merit or credit, and focus more on the rational thoughts. Those are the thoughts that are true, and the thoughts that do help you feel the way you want to feel and do help you achieve your goals.
so what happens when you have a client who, on one hand, wants to feel better, but on the other hand, doesn't want to let go of some of those irrational thoughts, some of the irrational thinking. I think I struggle with that. I struggle with clients who, on one hand, they don't connect the negative cognitions with how they're feeling about how it impacts them. They don't make that correlation. So I think it's those patients that can be very challenging. And I think maybe I suffer from that at times. Maybe I don't have the insight yet myself. I need to keep working on that.
Yeah. I am guilty of this too, and that is a challenge. My first go-to for myself, and then also for clients, is to look at what could potential secondary gains be from having that thought or that feeling, to really strip it down and uncover, well, by me thinking that way, that keeps me dependent on a person or a spouse or a parent, or um, it keeps me without accountability or without responsibility for
Mm,
a certain thing.
mhm. I think that's great. I think that's really good insight into what that could be about. I also struggle with clients who are really insightful and learn and make changes, but when they leave my office and go back into the world, they enter into a world where there's a lot of criticism. Maybe they have a spouse who is very critical of them. So it kind of undoes a lot of the work that we do, once a week for 45 minutes. That all gets undone
Mm-hmm.
for, those 6 other days that they're not in my office. And
Right.
so, what do you do then? It's, because they come in and they've kind of not forgotten, but um, there's something that's habit forming about that. It could because all their negative stuff gets reinforced all week, and then they come into your office and they're kind of back at square one, kind of over and over and over, and that can be challenging too. And
Absolutely.
so that's why I think it's good probably to give clients something to take with them, a skill or a technique or a strategy or a coping mechanism that they can use in the moment, in vivo, which probably is what really causes the most change behaviorally. Most behavioral change is the kind of change that you can achieve through some kind of action.
Yeah.
And I'd say thought could be an action, conscious thought. Um, and one technique that I've used is mantras, is to help clients come up with their own mantra, whatever that is for them. And sometimes it can be, if they're experiencing a particularly um, difficult moment where they're being unnecessarily critical of themselves, to say something nice about themselves, or say something that is calming, or say something that is true, such as, even though I failed at X, Y, and Z, I am still a competent and adequate person, or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's
And
great.
and I think that can be helpful.
That's wonderful. Yeah, to have some, even if it's just positive self-talk, something that can remind you, that can trigger, to get you back into the right frame of mind, um, and whatever that looks like for that person, that has meaning for that person.
Right.
Very helpful.
Yeah. So
I
just
like that technique.
another technique that I use that I thought would be good to talk about here.
Absolutely. Yeah. Do you have one that you use for yourself?
Not really. Because it can change. It can change depending on, if I'm having a really bad day, then it might be something different. Um, but no, I can't say that I have one that I use on a regular basis for myself, because our moods change. So no, but I think it's good to come up with. You can. I think it's good to come up with one, and you put it on like an index card, or you put it on in the notes app on your phone or something like that. And in a
Right.
moment when you really need it, boom, you can pull it up and it's there.
Sure. I like that. So maybe I'll recap for our listeners, and then if there's any burning desires at the end, we can share. With regards to challenging our negative thoughts and negative thought patterns, we talked about some tips and some interventions that we use ourselves and that we use with clients. One of the top ones was mindfulness, the art of mindfulness, and being mindful in the situation. If you can recall writing the chapter in the novel 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, using and enlisting all of your senses to fully describe the moment that you're in. Uh, being aware and observing, just watching, being an observer of your thoughts and your emotions, and just sort of acknowledging them and taking them in, and from an outside perspective. Also, the idea of disputing or debating those thoughts. Remember the example of the jury type of thing, and appealing to either side. Um, Defining whether or not your thoughts are positive or negative, and then rational versus irrational, and some techniques doing that. Thinking about whether or not this is helping me feel the way I want to feel, achieve the goals that I want to achieve, and is this thought really based on a fact?
Mm-hmm.
And also having a mantra, that's something that you can recite, that you can remind yourself, or that triggers a more positive state of mind. Um, all those things can be helpful, and try all of them, or at least one of them in your life, and see if you can't just attack and challenge some of those negative thoughts as you improve and as you grow in a positive direction. Any last thoughts, Michael?
Yeah, I think just the the use of unproductive versus productive thinking, I think for me that's just so helpful, because I just think that's very helpful. It makes it much clearer, I think, for folks to be able to identify what thoughts they should be having and what thoughts they should be looking out for. If it's not producing what you want, then that's pretty clear. If it's
Right.
not producing what you want, that's clear. So I think it helps folks to separate out that kind of stuff. I don't know if you can hear that. This is what
Yeah.
happens every night at 7 o'clock. I don't know if they're doing it in Vero. Are they doing it in Vero too for the healthcare workers?
No. No. What are they doing?
At 7 o'clock every night, the neighborhood makes noise to honor the healthcare workers.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
Huh. Well, I know,
Not
since
not
we're
like every single night though.
well, I know we're, at least I'm working from home, so, and doing virtual sessions, teletherapy sessions with clients. So that's always fun and exciting, because when you're home, you have the dryer going off, and then I have dogs, and our dogs are barking, at the Amazon delivery, person, and of course the random motorcycle that goes by. So I apologize for any of those inconvenience in the podcast, and I'm not at the level of editing yet to remove those types of things. But yeah, I was hearing I thought maybe your wife was just baking, mixing up brownies or something.
No, it's for the healthcare workers.
Right on. That's awesome. My wife is a nurse, so I have to give her a lot of credit for doing that, and it's stressful. And not to get too much into this coronavirus thing, but it's just a very challenging, stressful time
Sure.
for everyone.
Sure.
So yeah, I honor the healthcare workers.
And we are healthcare workers too.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, of course, in Florida, we're all essential. We're all essential workers.
Right.
Anyway, that's sort of
Lucky us.
yeah. Well, Michael, always a pleasure, and I look forward to our next conversation, because I think we can camp on to all the different things that we've already expressed, and then share some new insights. And I enjoy some of the philosophical banter back and forth too.
Yeah, I look forward to seeing you next time and having more of these conversations.
And with that loud whistle honoring the healthcare workers, we'll hit our closing theme and take us on out. Thanks again, brother.